Welcome to the pharmaphorum podcast. My name's Dominic Tyer, and I'm pharmaphorum's creative and editorial director. In this instalment, I spoke to Philip Cruz, who's GlaxoSmithKline's vaccines medical director for the UK and Ireland, and a paediatrician by training, about vaccine development and distribution. We looked at the discovery and commercialisation of new vaccines and the clear pre- and post-COVID differentiation that we've seen. We also talked about the impact anti-vax misinformation has had on vaccine uptake in recent years and whether COVID has changed that. You can find more details of this episode, including a download link for the podcast and information about other instalments in the series at pharmaphorum.com/podcast. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher and Podbean, where you can find and subscribe to it by searching for pharmaphorum. Philip, welcome to the pharmaphorum podcast. I wonder if we could start off with, you can give the listeners a quick introduction to yourself.
Thank you very much, and a pleasure to be here. So my name is Philip Cruz. I'm the Vaccines Medical Director for GlaxoSmithKline here in the UK and Ireland. I've been with the company for more than a decade, but in the pharmaceutical industry, almost 16 years. Wow, time flew by. But yes, with my experience in terms of vaccine development and what we call medical affairs, this gives me a view of really what's happening in terms of the world of vaccine development and how it applies to the pandemic.
So looking at what's happening in the world of vaccine development, or rather pre-COVID, what was happening in terms of vaccine development, what did the picture look like from your perspective pre-COVID?
I think what's happening right now really is with a banner headline of unprecedented. And that's all caps, all bold fonts, because really what happened right now is going away from the traditional vaccine development model. So what you see previously in terms of vaccine clinical development is a linear process. So it goes from early clinical stages or early clinical phases up until you go to preclinical and then transfer to clinical. Because it's a huge investment, you have to be methodical in your approach in terms of getting the funding for the next step of clinical development. And that's why it had to go through a linear process. Plus, the high failure rate, let's say, of an asset or a vaccine or a medicine in development to go all the way through registration from bench or laboratory research. So that high failure rate of research, together with the high cost of investment, provides that time frame where usually it will take around from 10 to 15 years. But looking historically, it's really hard to predict. I mean, there are some diseases where it's been decades or even really long times before discovery to coming up with a vaccine. So yes, that's the main challenge really. And if you look historically, the quickest one from discovery of, let's say, the pathogen or the virus or the bacteria to when the vaccine became available, I think would be mumps, where you had 3 years from discovery in 1945 up until having an inactivated vaccine in 1948. But do note, like for malaria, it's been more than a century from discovery until having a vaccine that can be given to patients. But yeah, so these are the challenges that go. And now how it has evolved right now from that traditional mode of vaccine development, it has now become, I should say, more streamlined, accelerated, because with a pandemic that has this kind of global effect and a public health emergency, you have to be agile. You have to look at steps where you can accelerate. So do note that there are no shortcuts there. It's all about acceleration, where investment has been given upfront by supranational organizations, we call, like governments, so that companies and their research teams can do the development at a quicker pace and somehow working more agile in having different phases run through at the same time, or having even regulatory authorities look at it in real time. So you kind of save some time there. And this has been proven to be the crucial part of the current vaccine development landscape.
And so, if as you did, you would characterize vaccine development pre-COVID as very much a linear process. I suppose in business terms, the industry's typically looked on vaccines as being more sort of steady growers, perhaps, rather than the superstars in their product portfolio. But if it were a linear process before COVID, how was that? How would you characterize the vaccine landscape that we currently see?
So what we're seeing right now is a culmination of everyone's efforts. So I think nowhere in history have you seen really a concerted effort, a unified effort to get a vaccine or medicine up until development. So everyone's working on it, and that really helps because it's all about teamwork. It's all about having everyone kind of consolidate all their learnings into one united effort. And that's why you see right now in the landscape different modes of vaccine technologies or even medicines. You have different modes of therapeutics. And this is great. This is comforting because it's like humanity at its finest, where everyone that has that competency is contributing to mankind, humankind. So yeah, it's a great time to be a scientist and to be a patient actually.
And in terms of your work within GSK, and how companies such as GSK look at vaccines development, has that changed your standing? Or not personally necessarily your standing, but has that changed the standing of vaccines within the corporate environment as well? I imagine that all of a sudden there must be a whole heap of focus, maybe of pressure on you and your colleagues at the moment.
I think really where we want to see this in terms of the perspective of vaccine development at to what stage we are kind of looking or focusing at. For example, what my point being is for those like the mRNA technologies, that wasn't developed overnight. That was in development even before, even a decade before. People were already looking at these different platforms where they were not really going into, let's say, full steam ahead in terms of vaccine development, but kind of looking at other ways to refine the approach. However, now, born by the pandemic, we people had to really, have that courage, let's say, to pursue these, and with the right investments. And the key term here is really the investment, because ultimately it's all about working with these resources to come up with that outcome that is desired. Because do note, statistics is really against vaccine development because, for example, in phase 3, even 30% of vaccines in development fail. So, there's that risk that goes into it, and especially when you look at it from a business side, because every business opportunity, you want to get that, let's say, cost back into research and development, because it's a life cycle, as we call it. Vaccine development continues. It doesn't stop with having a vaccine jabbed into a patient, because ultimately it's all about how you look at clinical trials, how do you look at effectiveness, you measure data on the impact, and therefore you can refine how this vaccine is given to patients on a broader scale.
And I wanted to look next at to get your thoughts on some of the challenges in terms of vaccine distribution. I mean, we're talking now, of course, in February 2021. We've heard just yesterday, in fact, that the Prime Minister set out his roadmap for trying to open up the country. And certainly when this particular episode is published in March 2021, we should be, fingers crossed, some way down the line, or moving towards that more of an opening up of the country from the lockdown restrictions. And clearly a key part of that is going to be the ongoing rollout of vaccines of all sorts. In terms of that rollout, vaccine distribution, do you talk a bit about where traditionally the challenges might have been pre-COVID, as we tend to have to divide everything up nowadays, but also where you see those distribution challenges at the moment?
The key message here is all about vaccine coverage. It's all about uptake, because the success of any vaccination program is on the level of uptake a population gives for the certain vaccine. For example, for measles, we lost our measles free status 2 years ago, and therefore we're playing catch up, and hopefully we get a resurgence of our coverage to levels which are considered realistic and ideal. So therefore, there's still room for acceptance, let's say, of vaccines in the program. So that has been the main challenge. And of course, when you speak of distribution, there also is the topics of, let's say, of maintaining the proper storage conditions or cold chain, maintaining it at 2 to 8 degrees for most vaccines. And therefore, you have all of these factors incorporated. And it's all about also the way the vaccine is distributed. And again, given that these vaccines come at a schedule, you need to have an efficient manner of telling patients when they need to come back for their succeeding doses. So these are all the factors that go into how a vaccine program can be measured as successful.
And then in terms of vaccine programs, in terms of GSK's own involvement in COVID vaccine research, can you tell me a bit about your company's recent deal with CureVac? What will that involve?
I think it's leveraging upon each one's strengths, because ultimately it's all about a synergy, a collaboration. And ultimately, vaccine development should not stop. We should always look at opportunities where we can leverage upon each other's strengths. And for the one that GSK went into a deal with CureVac, it's all about, as I said, leveraging on each other's strengths. And it's something that hopefully will provide a solution in the future of all the concerns that we have at the moment, such as having this variants that is evolving. Because as we know, it's all about understanding how virus behaves. And that's key to coming up with a solution is, of course, understanding the behavior and then ultimately tweaking the solution to adjust and address that specific, let's say, variant that evolves, or everything else that goes into the complexity of addressing viral infections.
And you mentioned earlier that the huge efforts that the industry, that the whole life sciences wider sector has seen in terms of the development of COVID vaccines and the shortening of timelines. It really has been humanity at its finest, and I would certainly agree with you on that point, and I'm sure all of our listeners would as well. But in terms of something that's been less fine around humanity, I personally would certainly place sort of anti-vaccination misinformation into that camp. From your time during the industry, as you mentioned, more than sort of 16 years in pharma, what sort of impact over the years have you seen this anti-vax misinformation have on vaccine uptake?
Yes, and this is very significant to address. And what you mentioned about misinformation can sometimes be lack of information. And that is a significant percentage of people that have somehow doubts about getting vaccines. So they need to have access to information of just understanding what they are going to receive or what their child is going to receive. And also a significant factor is how vaccines are administered. It could be something that could be logistic, such as access. I mean, when we did a market research at the beginning of the pandemic, where we looked at UK parents' views of vaccines in light of COVID-19 in May 2020, we surveyed around 2,500 parents. And we found out that parents are still very supportive of vaccines, with 93% of them happy for their children to be vaccinated generally, and 29% more likely now than before the pandemic to take up vaccinations for their children or themselves. However, it also found that only 27% are comfortable attending a medical center for these vaccines, down from 91% pre-pandemic. So this is where you have to be mindful of what those concerns that parents might have. In terms of scheduling a vaccine appointment, or, just being reassured that the vaccination center has, all of these measures to really reassure parents that, infection control measures are in place. So these are the pieces of information that is very significant to address, because it's all about listening to what parents and patients are concerned of and then addressing them. That's why we also want to focus on education of healthcare professionals, making sure that they feel confident of communicating messages around their patients.
And so if that's parents and patients, how about on a governmental level? What sort of changes have you seen in terms of the government's approach to both COVID vaccines and maybe the broader vaccination portfolio? We have so much focus, understandably so, on COVID at the moment, but vaccines have such an important role to play across a wide range of diseases. Have you seen any changes from a governmental perspective?
And of course, this will always be a challenge, but the government is adequately looking at measures, let's say, that would determine if a vaccine is successful. So you have those metrics, we call it, the measurement parameters or indicators that would give you an indication where you need to catch up. So there are areas in the UK where vaccination coverage rates can be improved. So it's all about finding these areas, listening to local stakeholders and understanding whether they have doubts or any concerns, and then addressing them right then and there, because it's all about understanding, being aware, and then and providing solutions, be it education or be it support. Because when you listen to some parents or respondents in surveys, they want to take their child for vaccinations, but they've had, let's say, experienced issues and challenges around having a practice closed or an appointment canceled by GP practices or limited appointments. So you just need to be aware of these and give support where needed.
So, Philip, finally, then, I'd just ask you to look into the short term, into the medium term future, and give me your thoughts on what's next in terms of vaccines, particularly in the fight against COVID. I mean, what should listeners be looking out for? What sort of trends might they expect to see coming through?
I think right now what we need to be aware of is leverage on the gains and address the pains. The gains being there's a health consciousness that we have given that of the pandemic. And we saw that last year when the flu season was its height, where we achieved the target of getting people vaccinated against influenza. In fact, there was a shortage of supply towards the end of last year. And thankfully, I was able to get my flu vaccine early this year when supply was back in full swing. So it's all about addressing that new health consciousness and basically addressing misinformation as well. So addressing those pains, giving the proper access. I mean, you can always visit the NHS website, NHS Choices, for more information. And please also just when your GP tells you that you have a schedule that you need to come into the surgery to get your vaccinations or some health checkups, please do comply and abide with those appointments, because it's very difficult. The healthcare staff at the surgeries and the GP clinics really take a lot of resource just to call and recall patients back into to fulfill their appointments. So yes, be aware and be prepared. And if you have any questions, to ask them before your visit. So again, during the time of pandemic, you minimize any time or interactions that can be addressed online or via the phone.
Excellent. Well, and hopefully we can very much leverage all of those gains that you mentioned. But for now, Philip, thank you very much for joining me on the pharmaphorum podcast.
My pleasure, and thank you very much for having me.
And that concludes episode 33 of the pharmaphorum podcast and my discussion with GlaxoSmithKline's Philip Cruz. You can find more details of this episode, including a download link for the podcast and information about other instalments in the series at pharmaphorum.com/podcast. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, and Podbean, where you can find and subscribe to it by searching for pharmaphorum. And don't forget to visit our website to sign up for daily or weekly email pharmaceutical news and analysis bulletins, and follow us on Twitter, where we are at pharmaphorum.